I'm Quentin,
And I'm Bella.
and this is a Gothic study. Welcome, everyone, to a Gothic study, a companion piece to the last week's episode of a Gothic story. We're going through an analysis and, I guess, summary as well of the Castle of Otranto, which, if you were listening, we did a little excerpt on in a Gothic story last week.
Yes.
So where do we start? Where do you want to start with this?
Let's start with a little background of the story.
Right. This story was written in 1762 by Horace Walpole. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly.
I believe.
He was the son of the Great Britain's first Prime Minister, Robert. And Horace had a great fascination with medieval history. He loved it. He was well versed in the medieval times. And he went so far as to create his own castle in England. I think it's called Strawberry Hill. He has his own little estate, own little castle that he had built for it.
Yeah.
And one night he had a nightmare in his castle, which inspired him to write the Castle of Otranto, which is considered to many to be the first ever Gothic story. It has all the tropes, haunted castles, apparitions, spooky noises, things that would go on to inspire Mary Shelley and Lord Byron, and just a plethora of Gothic stories and authors from the 1700s up to the 1800s and even to now.
It all started with him.
And so he writes this story, and there's strangely enough background for the story as well. It's fictional background where it was, quote unquote, discovered in a castle somewhere. I don't remember where. It was discovered in this castle, and it was believed to come from a 15th, 16th century manuscript that was translated from a medieval Crusade time story. That was the belief. That's what he wrote for the preface. That's what a lot of people believed. And when they read the story, when the story came out, it was well received. It had a lot of good praise and reviews from it until they realized that the background of the story wasn't true, and the whole thing was made up.
Right.
And after that, people did not like the story at all. They thought it was just superficial and just not very well written.
Yeah.
When not that long ago, it was a year after the story released that the author was like, no, yeah, it's fiction. Like, oh, now the story's terrible after really enjoying it.
Right.
So it's interesting that once the facade's been lifted, it's like,
For sure.
oh, actually, this story's not very good at all.
The slight shift in perception just changed the entire reception.
So the story of this Gothic story is, it's all about lineage. And you have Manfred, who is the current lord over the castle of Otranto, and he has two children, Conrad and Matilda. Conrad, he loves more than Matilda. The book describes how he always dotes on Conrad, and Conrad's always described to be a sickly child. He was sickly as a kid, and he had arranged a marriage between his son and Lord Frederick, who has his own domain and castle. Conrad to be married to Frederick's daughter, Isabella. But when the day of the wedding comes, for some miraculous, bizarre reason, a massive helmet, cast iron helmet from the night just falls from the sky and crushes Conrad to death. An interesting way to start out your story.
Absolutely.
And Manfred worried about his lineage, his line, his blood being destroyed because Manfred was his son, his only son. And his wife, Hippolyta, I think couldn't bear any children anymore, and a king's always got to have a son to complete the lineage. So he decides, instead of calling off the wedding to Isabella, that Manfred would marry Isabella instead.
Yes.
And at that point, he tries to, keep her at the castle once he escapes. She escapes with the help of a peasant named Theodore, who Manfred thought to be the perpetrator of killing his son and keeps him imprisoned in the giant helmet.
Right.
And he escapes, and he helps Isabella escape. And that's all from the excerpt you all listened to last week, which was chapter 1. We only did chapter 1 because it's not that long of a book, but we didn't want it was taking a lot more.
It has a little bit of length to it.
It has a little bit of length, and unfortunately, not to sound lazy, but it will sound lazy. We didn't really have time to do all of it. Would have taken a lot more effort.
Right.
So that all you all know from the excerpt, which was chapter 1. There's 5 chapters.
Yes.
I guess a brief rundown is Theodore helps Isabella escape. He escapes to an underground tunnel that leads to the St. Nicholas Church. Manfred apprehends Theodore, imprisons him again, and is slated to execute Theodore until the arrival of one of the friars of St. Nicholas. Comes in to intervene because Isabella at that point tells him everything and pleads with Manfred not to kill Theodore because he was going to do it right at the courtyard outside where the massive statue is, massive helmet. And he pleads with him, begs with him. Manfred's not listening at all. And it's discovered from a birthmark, I think it's on the shoulder. Because of that birthmark, apparently the friar recognizes Theodore to be his long-lost son. Big plot twist out of nowhere. Very melodramatic. Mm-hmm. And apparently the friar used to be a lord somewhere, and his mother died, he lost his way, and he became a friar, because that was I guess, according to this story, that's the custom. We don't have anything else to do, nowhere else to go. You just become part of the church.
Right.
And so he pleads with Manfred to spare his son. But he does, and he locks him up in the tower. Now, at that point, a barrage of knights holding up a giant sword comes to the castle to demand for Isabella, because they are Frederick's consorts, his men. It turns out Frederick has been off to war and has been presumed dead or missing in action, a prisoner of war. So on behalf of Frederick, they go to collect Isabella. And what happens now is just a whole large manhunt with Manfred and his men and Frederick's men to go find Isabella, to try to it's a race to get to her first. Matilda, after talking with Theodore the night before, because he discovered him wandering outside the castle walls after helping Isabella escape, kind of starts falling for him a bit, and Isabella kind of does too. It's a weird triangle where neither are adamant about confessing to each other that they like Theodore.
Yeah, they want to maintain their friendship, but are both falling for Theodore.
Or in this case, Theodore falls for Matilda.
Yeah.
Because Matilda helps Theodore escape.
True.
So Theodore runs off and finds Isabella, finds her. There's a knight that finds them as well. It's in the middle of the woods. Ed challenges Theodore to a duel because Theodore thinks he's an enemy. One of Manfred's men.
Yes.
So they fight. Theodore, having no training, manages to not mortally wounding, but wounding quite a bit, the knight, and it turns out to be Frederick. Yeah. He managed to escape, and because he had a vision that Isabella was in danger. I know this all sounds mad.
A little bit like a fever dream.
It's theatrical, it's Gothic.
Yeah.
So Frederick manages to escape because he had a vision that Isabella was in trouble. So they all go back to the castle, and Frederick, heals his wounds, and Frederick and Manfred decide not to have a wager, but a deal for Manfred to marry Isabella and Frederick to marry Matilda.
Wonderful.
Because the whole thing about these two is both have stakes to the estate of the castle of Otranto, because for some reason, one or another, their family long ago were allegiance to this great lord, Alfonso, a great crusader who died many years ago, who actually, if I remember correctly, Manfred's ancestors was like the right-hand man to Alfonso. So it's all the stakes of who gets proper ownership of the castle, because For some reason, both Manfred and Frederick have rights to it. So they decide to both marry each other's daughters. But then Frederick has a weird premonition, vision that makes him... It scares him to the core because he sees a ghost, basically, and calls off the deal. Enraged, Manfred, from one of his servants, hears that Theodore is with Isabella at St. Nicholas, the St. Nicholas Church. Furious by everything going wrong, he decides to take his revenge. He's going to kill Isabella because he wouldn't have her. She wouldn't have him. Now, he can never have her. And I guess the old trope, if I can't have her, no one can.
Exactly.
He goes to the church and stabs Isabella, but lo and behold, it was not Isabella with Theodore, it was Matilda.
Yeah.
Very Shakespearean. The whole thing is Shakespearean, which we will talk about. Distraught over killing his own daughter, they take them all back to the castle, and the inner castle wall explodes, and a large apparition of Alfonso appears and deems Theodore to be the rightful heir of Otranto because he is Alfonso's descendant.
Yes.
Because we find out Manfred's ancestors actually poisoned and killed Alfonso and took the estate for themselves. So Theodore is the rightful ruler. Hippolyta and Manfred decide to go to the church because that's the only thing you can do after you have nothing. Still distraught over Matilda because Theodore had fallen in love with Matilda, even though they met for like 30 minutes.
Right, as one does.
He goes to marry Isabella and becomes the ruler of Otranto, and that's your lot. That's the quick rundown
Drama-filled story.
The first Gothic story. Very spooky. There's a lot of wailings and apparitions and ghosts. Very, very melodramatic.
Yes.
Which it kind of makes sense. Because first, I guess we'll talk about this from a literary point of view and a actual historic point of view.
Okay.
This is a very Shakespearean story. It's very much rooted in Shakespeare. I mean, you have the most obvious comparison is Hippolyta, who is, yes, named after Ares, the god of war's demigoddess daughter. Hippolyta was an Amazon, I guess, goddess of war.
I'm not sure what the correct title would be, but,
But the character Hippolyta is derived also from the Shakespeare character from Midsummer Night Dream. I think she was also engaged in that one to be wed. I don't know the story of the wedding goes off with a hit. So you have that going forward. You have the fact that Manfred seeing apparitions of his ancestors very much in the same vein as Hamlet when Hamlet sees his own father and makes Hamlet swear to him to take revenge. And there's a kind of a revenge piece going on, kind of not. It's all about like the rightful ownership of things, which
it's
is
like an ancestral revenge,
which is rooted in Richard II, I think, or part 2. I don't know. There's my Shakespeare knowledge only goes so far, but it's rooted in Hamlet, rooted in Macbeth. So we have all these ideas and not analysis and concepts ripped from Shakespeare. You have the fact that a lot of the servants like Bianca and Manfred's men of like Diego and Jaquez are all played for comedic effect, and that's how it is for a lot of Shakespeare stuff. Is the servants are always like the comedy foil, and a lot to like other like farces as well. Servants are known to be the comedic character, but the historic wise, and also because there's twists and turns like in Shakespeare with Theodore being a long lost son, being the heir to Alfonso, and the big twist of Manfred killing Matilda when he thought it was Isabella. That's probably the most Shakespearean tragedy of them all.
Yeah.
But from a historic standpoint, you could argue that the Castle of Otranto is very much a somewhat autobiographical story from Horace Walpole. because not only did he have, like I said, a great love for the medieval era, he was also Earl of, I think it's Oxford. And he was the last heir because he didn't have I don't think he was married. He didn't have any children. After his nephew died, he was the last in line. Mm-hmm. Very much like Manfred, after Conrad died, was last in line to inherit the Otranto castle. So you have this interesting thing where reality kind of bleeds into fiction.
Yeah.
But I don't think Horace was ever interested in having children. It's just funny that it deals with lineage and bloodlines when after Horace...
It's almost like he writes it from the perspective of a different version of his own reality.
Right. Maybe subconsciously upset that the Earl line, I think it was the fourth Earl, and the lineage would eventually pick up with another distant relative. So it wasn't forever, but for a period of time when he died and after, there was no Earl. I think the lineage is now completely gone. So it's interesting you have like these similar ideas bleeding in, and I wonder if it's a subconscious thing that Horace was thinking about, that was maybe not weighing into his mind, but also like just something he was, like I said, thinking about.
Yeah, like a disconnected fictional autobiography of what could have been.
Then you have Manfred himself, which some believe is partially based off of the King Manfred, who was in his lineage during the Crusade times, ironically enough. Ended up being the last king of Sicily in his lineage. Not, of course, the last king of Sicily or Italy or whatever, ever, but he was the last of his line and he ended up dying. Interestingly enough, also had domain over the actual castle of Otranto, which did exist.
Very interesting.
So you have all these elements of real life, historic life, and just fantasy all mixed into this macabre and spooky, sometimes funny, like melodramatic, first ever Gothic story.
Yes. So what part of the story like stuck with you the most after finishing it?
Honestly, I really enjoyed the side characters. I enjoyed Bianca and Diego and Jaquez, just like, because everything's just so dramatic.
Yeah.
And everyone's just lamenting and like, oh, woe is me. Just, it's all very melodramatic. So it's always nice to have these sprinkled in humorous characters to bring light and brevity to it. That's the thing that always stuck out to me. Because when I was reading, I'm like, no, these characters are actually really funny. They give like a lot of brevity because there's a scene in the beginning of chapter 1, not in the beginning of chapter 1, but towards the end, where Jaquez and Diego are trying to tell Manfred the apparition they saw, and Manfred's like, oh, I just spit it out, for God's sakes.
Right.
And they're just talking over each other and like trying to be like, and he saw this, and he told me this, and Manfred's like, oh God, for God's sakes, just spit it out. That part was pretty funny. Bianca always like being very blunt and forward, as I feel like a lot of maid characters tend to be, just sassy, upfront, blunt, speaking their mind, isn't afraid to like backtalk to their masters.
Right.
So that was the thing that always stuck in my mind amidst all the, like I said, tragedy and melodramas, these really, really funny moments.
Yeah.
And really the big, not really the big twist of Theodore being the heir, but the death of Matilda.
Yeah, that was a very intense moment.
Because like, I was thinking like, oh, Christ is going to go after, I thought he was really going after Theodore.
Yeah. Because
Theodore has been just the bane of his existence, thought he killed Conrad, which I don't know how. They thought Theodore was a necromancer. I don't know.
He wanted to be with Isabella, so like.
Yeah, but I don't know if Manfred knew that.
Yeah, true.
But it was at that point where he thought it was Isabella, like, fueled by anger and jealousy, he decides, all right, I'm gonna end this. If I can't have her, no one else can.
Yeah.
Ended up being Matilda. Yeah, I didn't expect that.
Not at all. That was definitely a little bit of a surprise.
With all the twists and turns and like soap opera, like, oh, he's my long lost son and all that.
And it's interesting to me, one thing that stood out to me is, Matilda was a very dedicated daughter throughout like the whole story, relatively speaking.
Despite the fact that Manfred may not have loved her, I don't know. He certainly didn't like her.
Questionable.
Yeah. He always doted on...
Questionable love, for sure.
Manfred always doted on Conrad. And I think the text, like, that's one of the first things the text says. Mm-hmm. But I guess it's that obedient, be a good daughter.
Yeah.
To your parents.
And in the end, it led to nothing but an empty death for her, which is really tragic.
But then she goes on to say to be like... Forgive Manfred, forgive my father. He know not what he does. Despite the fact that, you're dying and he's right there with unnecessary death. It's just that old, I guess it's a religious thing of like, no matter what, always honor thy mother and father.
For sure, yeah.
Even if your father is trying to
marry you off
and like,
use you as a pawn for his own happiness in any way possible.
And take your friend Isabella, like, just away from it all and, like, forcibly marry her. But every time she always tries to be like, which is despite except for the fact she rescues Theodore, she's always trying to be the good daughter and always do what Hippolyta and Manfred tells her to do. And she got stabbed in the back. Metaphorically and literally.
Yeah. It's interesting how at the end of the story, both siblings are not there. It's also interesting because, she wanted to potentially like go become a nun herself.
Yep.
And then in the end of the story, both of her parents end up going into the church.
That's the thing. That's what you do.
Yeah.
If you're a wife, you're a wife. But if you're like a lord over someone, if you don't have your castle, or if you don't marry, you just become a nun. That's the only career path for anyone. You're either a wife, a lord, or a nun.
Right. What a life. What do you think was the most predictable thing to happen in the story? What did you read and you were like, it was building up to this, and yes.
I think it was the Theodore reveal, not the first one.
Yeah.
Because no one could ever predict that. Mm-hmm. But the second one where Theodore is like the rightful heir to Alfonso, because I think it's either Frederick or Manfred who comments that Theodore looks like the spitting image of Alfonso. I'm like, oh, okay, he's the heir.
Yeah.
That's like so painfully obvious.
Right.
So once I didn't expect like half the castle to explode.
Oh yeah, no.
To be like a giant Alfonso, like, it's him. That's the one. And if it was like, oh god, okay, we can't like argue with a giant 20-foot ghost.
Right.
So yeah, that was probably the most predictable because they kind of like set it up very easily. Be like, okay, he looks like Manfred. I mean, he looks like Alfonso. He's probably the heir of Alfonso. Mm-hmm. Then I kind of thought that like Manfred's ancestors may have killed Alfonso.
Yeah, you could definitely kind of get that vibe.
Because from Manfred, like, Manfred's going to do whatever it takes to continue his bloodline, even though the slight incestual thing of, like, Isabella was almost like her daughter-in-law. But that's fine, you can be my wife instead.
Great. So, obviously there's a lot of tragedy in this story. Which character do you think has the most tragic story? It's a hard question.
Well, Manfred's no good because he's like the main antagonist of the piece. I have no sympathy for Manfred.
You can't really feel bad for him.
I would have to say, like...
You have to pick one.
It's a bit of a cop-out. Mm-hmm. Maybe Matilda?
Okay.
Because he's the only one that, besides Conrad, dies.
Yeah.
But honestly, no. Not Matilda. Yeah. Hippolyta.
I do feel deeply for Hippolyta.
She loses her son.
Yeah.
3 days later, she loses her daughter.
She loses her marriage in the...
Her husband tries to divorce her.
Yeah.
Which he gladly was like, yeah, well...
For a younger woman, which is so many people's fear.
Yeah. And she was like, it's that thing of like always have to do what the man of the household says, which is, I don't know, that's from like, from a medieval standpoint, a Renaissance standpoint, or 18th century standpoint, because it has technically different timelines as we talked about.
Right.
Or just an old, burned out, sexist, misogynist standpoint, but whatever. Mm-hmm. She just gladly, like, if it'll make you happy, I will divorce and I'll become a nun. Like, you can stand up for yourself a bit.
Right, yeah.
But probably Hippolyta, because she loses both her children, and her husband kills one of her children.
Yeah.
And tries to divorce her because he can't have... I don't know if that was a lie that he can't have other children. I think his lie was saying that they're like distant cousins. That's why the marriage is no good.
Yeah. Which in and of itself was...
And if that's true, it goes back to that weird incest thing, which is weird, especially for like 1764.
Right.
Written by a prominent politician, because Horace was also member of Parliament for many years, and his father was first Prime Minister.
Yes.
So it's just maybe that's why people didn't like it, because it was kind of sleazy.
It definitely could be. What was the most impactful bit of like symbolism that you picked up on in the story?
Is there any symbolism? I mean, it's a melodramatic Gothic tale. It's very heavy-handed.
Yeah.
I guess it's kind of fun that there's the prophecy of something about the true heir of the estate will be shown when the former or the false one grows too large to remain in it. Mm-hmm. Either say it's Manfred's ego and power that he believes he can get away with anything.
Yeah.
That's grown too big to stand, or it's the apparitions of the bits of Knight of Alfonso with the helmet. People saw like a giant massive leg and things like that, until you get to the point where the actual 20, 30, 100 foot apparition of Alfonso just bursts through and breaks one of the walls of the castle.
Yeah.
Literally growing too big.
Right.
Or the lie has grown too big or whatever. I guess you could point it out to either of those things, either being Manfred, or just the heir of Alfonso itself, the lie and the conspiracy growing too large to be self-contained at all, just burst out like, that's him.
Right, yeah. So, overall, what did you think of the story?
I didn't mind it. It can get a bit bogged down with the language.
I would agree with that.
Which is sometimes the case for older works of fiction. Some not so much. But I don't know if it's because Horace Walpole was writing this medieval language or Renaissance language, or just... I don't think it was exactly the language of the 18th century, because...
Oh, it definitely wasn't.
No.
It was a little different.
Yeah.
Sure.
He's probably just trying to evoke that to help with the fake background of the story. For a lot of older texts, it just gets so bogged down the descriptive words and everything, where you're like, wait, what are they talking about? What are we talking about? But it was pretty straightforward to understand. I didn't really have a problem with the dialogue, because the dialogue is very medieval.
It was understandable.
Yeah, they use the classic, I guess you could call it the Shakespearean language, but it's not really.
Yeah.
These and thous and
right.
doths, didists.
I think it was more so just maybe a little drawn out in parts of the book.
It was, because there wasn't, probably for the time, people were like, ooh, spooky.
Yeah.
Because, there's a ghost, and there's talk of apparitions and weird noises and stuff. But really, after, like, the first chapter, in the last chapter, there's not really much of that. It's more of just men sitting down and talking about, like, this is what's going to happen, this is what I'm going to do. There could be no taking it back.
There's a lot of filler, it feels like.
Yeah, because you have the whole chase of Frederick's men and Manfred's men trying to find Isabella. You have the long, overdrawn conversation between Theodore, Bianca, and Matilda, which I liked.
Yeah. It almost felt like reading a soap opera a little bit.
I mean,
a little bit.
The keyword of the day I feel like is melodramatic, because I've been saying that the entire time, but it is It is very soap opera. It's like I said, you have Theodore being like, the friar, like my long lost son. I'm like, okay, that came out of nowhere. And
Right.
the death of Matilda and Theodore being the rightful heir. It's all like these.
Even like that dramatic death of Conrad right at the beginning.
Just, the like second page.
Right.
Just what do you mean a massive?
Out of nowhere, we're building this like deep admiration for Conrad. Psst. Nope.
What do you mean there's a massive helmet that just crushes him? Where did that come from? Yeah, it's very a lot of twists and turns and surprise, like people. No one really comes back from the dead, but
Yeah.
I guess Alfonso kind of does. It's a giant ghost.
Well, overall, I think it was a pretty good story, but for being considered the first work of Gothic literature, I feel like it's maybe a little underwhelming.
It is. It lays down all the
Yeah.
tropes: haunted castles, spooks, noises, apparitions, all that. Just it gives the atmosphere, describing the castle and all that. It lays down the works for what would become Dr. Jekyll,
Yeah.
Mr. Hyde, Frankenstein, Dracula.
It lays it down, but
Yes.
definitely gets built on much better later on.
It lays down the foundations, the brickwork
Yeah.
of what would become the castle that is Gothic literature, which is kind of like a combination of romantic literature as well, getting into like the 19th century, so it all kind of blends into this
Yeah,
one
for sure.
thing. And then you have like Southern Gothic literature now with like Interview with the Vampire. So it hasn't really gone away. H.P. Lovecraft, very much Gothic while creating its own subgenre of cosmic horror.
Yeah.
But it's all laid the groundwork to very, even like in film with a lot of the Hammer horror films of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and the Universal films of the 30s and 40s. Just when you hear Gothic, you think of just thunder crashing and castles and flickering lights and candles.
And certainly this did set like the premise for all of that.
Yeah, it all. I guess it kind of helped pave the way of. It may not. It definitely probably isn't the first horror story, but it paved the way to what we think certain aspects of horror is. It helped kind of nudge the genre to what it would become in the 19th century, very much in the Victorian era, when film came out, even to now.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, what story are you planning on reading next week?
Yes, next week we are going to be doing an excerpt. We're not doing the full. It's going to be like this one. It's going to be a novella, just like this one was. You can see it right here. It's all very nice, lit up and pretty, which I mean, the people listening to the podcast won't be able to see it, but you'll definitely be able to see it when the video comes out.
On our YouTube channel.
Yes, Ghost City Tours.
Be sure to like and subscribe.
The next story we're doing is The Picture of Dorian Gray, one of my favorites.
Very excited for that one.
And after that, then you just
have to keep watching and
just
find
wait and
out.
see. Is that it?
That's it. I'm Bella.
I'm Quentin.
And thank you for listening and or watching.
Till the next time.
Goodbye.